Hello folks, welcome to my YouTube channel Watercolor Impressions. Since we have been doing a series of winter painting, I want to continue the series and I wanted to do a winter rainy painting. This reference was taken in Toronto downtown. Before we get on to it, hit the subscribe button so you guys can get weekly video updates from our channel. And let's get started, guys. I always provide drawing template and reference for my painting. You can find the link to download in the video description. In any watercolors, I'll start with a light wash. So I'm using clean water. As it comes to the mid part of my painting, I'm using Payne's gray. And I also taped my watercolor paper on a block, and I'm just keep on rotating it so that the watercolor does what it does. Once you put on a paint, it just blends by itself. And you can see at the bottom I'm going a little bit darker. Even though it looks darker now, it will dry out and it gets lighter. Let's focus on the building in the midground. So I'm using raw amber for it. I don't know, whenever I start recording, there's a guy above me start drilling, and there's a person who is playing instrument. I think, they're spying me. Whenever I start recording, they keep on doing this. So either way, I took clean water and I kept the midground a little bit lighter. And I'm also pouring some water here and there. You will see in a second why I'm doing that. And I also want the foreground to be really darker. So that will help a good lead in for our painting. So for that I'm using raw amber and a little bit of Payne's gray in it. So now I'm focusing on the building at the background. So for that I'm using a little bit of Cerulean Blue, Payne's gray, but I also want to make sure that's lighter in value. And I'm also making sure it's like a lot of water in my brush. It's not super thick. Even though it looks darker now, it fades away and it gets lighter in value. And I also don't want to have a lot of hard edges in the background, so I soften the edge a little bit here and there in the background building. So now let's focus on the building in the foreground. So for this building, I'm making sure to have a clean straight lines because that will help us to show that it's in the midground. So I'm going to be flipping the canvas or the watercolor paper several times so that I know, like, if you put a value there, it just blends. You could see at the top I used gradient and a little bit of cobalt blue, and at the bottom I'm going a little bit stronger, so it creates a gradient from top to bottom, and it looks really good as it dries out. So I'm also taking raw amber and a little bit of Payne's gray in it, and I try to add the details, and I hate the tight look, so I pour some water in it and I made it messy. And you could see I blend everything by itself. Now you could see I'm throwing some more colors in there. I also feel like I made the midground building darker, but I'll reduce the value once it dries out. So now I'm focusing on the building in the front. It's the same thing. Make sure I'm softening the edge at the top, but at the bottom I'm kind of creating gradient. For creating the gradient, I'm using raw amber, a little bit of NeutralTint in it. And now I'm adding the people in the midground, and I'm making sure I have some water in my brush, and I'm to make sure they're lighter in value. So now let's focus on the foreground elements. There is like two elements which is sitting in the foreground. For that I'm using raw amber and a little bit of NeutralTint in it. And there is also a pole which they have it in winter during Christmas time. So there is also a lot of snow deposits happen near the wreath. So I'm making sure to leave gaps for it, and at the end we will use white paint to bring back the snow. And you also see I also left a white bit when I painted that big building because I want to have that yellow light in there as well, and that will have a really good detail in the foreground. And there is also trees which is on the right hand side. I don't want to make sure when I do this I want to make sure I do like really loose, because this is just acting as a detail and not our focus point. Our focus point is on the foreground with the reflections and the car reflection and everything on it, and in the building and the midground, and they also have some details. So I'm using Payne's gray and a lot of water in it because I don't want to read that darker. So I'm putting people now in the foreground. So there are only one person in the reference, but I thought it would be nice to add two person so we can have a little bit of reflection in the foreground. You could use any colors you want for the people. For the first person I use cobalt blue and a little bit of neutral tint. For the second one I use a little bit of a redder value on them. And for the car in the front, I'm using NeutralTint, and I want it dark as much as possible, because you will know once we add a light on the car, it will give a beautiful reflection on our foreground. So now let's focus on the foreground. This is going to act as a lead-in element as well. So I want to get it as dark as possible using dry brush stroke. I'm using Payne's Gray for it because I don't want a neutral tint. You could use Payne's Gray or neutral tint for it. And Payne's Gray have a little bit of cooler tone in it. That's why I like using Payne's Gray. And I'm not worried about the details. As you can see, there is a lot of details in our reference, but I'm not worried about it all, because I just want our focal point to get the people, the car, and the reflections on the foreground. The rest is just as a placeholders for our painting. There's also a light pole which is in the foreground. That's our main element. And when I do the light poles, I'm also making sure and I'm aware of my perspective, because that will also gives a really good illusion of sense of depth in our painting. And you can see for the wires, I use a black pen, and it's really hard to get really thin strokes with my brush. I don't want to like a really thin brush, so I use a pen for it. And I also want to separate the ground, the road, and the platform. So for that, I used a black value and I softened the edge. And now I'm going to add start the reflections in the midground. So I put a color wherever the object meets, and I use clean water and I bring it to the foreground. So let's start the reflection on the foreground. So I'm using clean water in the foreground. So I'll just take it till where the object meets, and then I use Umber and Payne's Gray to create a gradient. And you can see I also create a gradient darker value in the foreground, and as it goes to the midground, it gets a lighter value. So the building in the midground, it's going to be reflecting on the ground as well, so I'm going to have a really darker value for that. So it's the exact same thing. I'm using Umber, a little bit of neutral tint in it. And there's also a darker part in the platform as well, so I used Payne's Gray for it. As you can see, it's a quite easy process. You just have to throw some colors here and there, and then make sure to have a gradient from the midground to the background. So now I'm adding a darker values for the people as well as the objects, which is the foreground. For the midground, I don't touch anything. I'm just focusing on the foreground. That's it. So for that, I use Payne's Gray for it, and you can see it gives a beautiful illusion of reflection as soon as I added it. So now I'm going to do the same process. I'm going to introduce a darker value where the car sits, and I'm going to use clean water and create a gradient from the top to the bottom. We are almost at the end of our painting journey, and now it's a matter of fact, it will just take white paint and we can take out some of the highlights back in our painting. And you can see the gap I was talking about, the red. So I'm going to introduce a little bit of white paint there. And I'm also going to put some water there, because I get hard edges and soft edges as well. And as you can see, once we add that white paint, it gives a beautiful illusion impression of snow in there. So I'm going to do the same thing for the trees, as well as I lost a lot of details in the midground as well. So I'm going to bring a little bit of details using white paint. For the white paint, you could either use gouache or you can use Chinese white. It doesn't matter. And you can see, but I'm trying to make sure not to overdo our painting, because we got the mood right and everything right. So that's all about the painting. Now let's add some details for the car light, the car headlights in the front. So for that, I'm using, you could either use orange paint, but I'm using this color called Winsor Yellow, Indian Yellow, and I'm using a little bit of white paint in it, and it gives a beautiful reflection in the foreground for us. So I'm taking a flat brush now. I'm so much focused on the midground building, and it also coming in the front. So I'm going to take clean water. I'm going to wipe it from bottom to the top, and I let the water to go through it from the bottom to the top. So it will have a lighter value at the top, and it will have a darker value at the bottom. And I also don't want to have any sudden gradient, so I'm going to introduce a little bit of colors to have some gradient from top to bottom. And that's it, folks, and we're at the end of our painting journey. Now it's your turn to take the reference on the drawing template, and let's see what you can come up with. Thanks again for watching this winter rainy painting video tutorial with me. Let me know what you learned from this video and what's your favorite color in this painting. If you have any other questions or subjects you want me to cover in watercolors, write me at watercolorimpressions@gmail.com or comment below. Before we get on to it, hit the subscribe button so you guys can get weekly video updates from our channel. And please do share with your friends and family. And if you're a person who enjoys winter painting, I created a playlist for you guys, so please go and check it out. And good luck with your painting, folks.